Quraysh tribe, which Muhammad happened to be born into. Islam is occultic, and it's openly hostile to the West, not just the Jews, but the Christians also, as we should be painfully aware of today. The moon god, what are we talking about? He was called Sin, the controller of the night. It's a pun. It's no intention with the term of the Old English term sin, at least to my knowledge. Remember King Sennacherib. The word means sin multiplies its brothers. The moon god was considered the spiritual ruler of the world in Ur of the Chaldees. That's from where Abraham was called out from. And he would become the supreme deity of even the Babylonian Empire. His symbol, of course, was the crescent moon, which still to this day adorns the mosques. Over 1,200 in the United States, growing rapidly, over 1,000 in Great Britain, and so on. In Arabic, the term was al-ilah, and later gets contracted to Allah. That's not the Arabic name for God. It's the Arabic name for the God, a specific God, namely Allah is very specific. We'll talk about him in a minute. He became the Babylonian Bel, and he was worshipped long before Muhammad came on the scene. Abdullah is a common name, even in fact was the name of Muhammad's father, which Allah, it's Allah, it's the worship of Allah. That was his father's name. In pre-Islamic Arabia, there was a sacred cube called the Kaaba, which contained 360 idols, and the predecessor group were called the Sabians, and they indulged in moon worship. They required bowing to Mecca at set times every day because that's where all the idols were. They required pilgrimages to Mecca once in a lifetime. When you got there, you had made 7 circuits around the Kaaba, and then you run to the Wadi Mina to throw rocks at the devil. Those are all pagan practices that go on centuries before Muhammad comes on the scene, and they are still part of Islam today. It also included animistic worship, jinns as they call them, genies as we call them in our folklore, in the English, the evil eye, fatalism, and so forth. All kinds of other occultic practices, and these you can find in the Quran and surahs. I won't go through them all, but there are references here. There are biblical injunctions against this and penalties expressed in the Scripture. They'll be in the notes if you're interested. We are indebted to many very competent pioneering scholars. There's literally a dozen listed here throughout the late 19th century, which uncovered overwhelming evidence that Muhammad constructed his religion from existing materials within the Arabic culture. Recognize he and the culture was illiterate, but the Christians and Jews that would be trafficking through Mecca were not. And what he assembled really was elements of Christian Gnosticism, which was flowering in those days, as well as Jewish and Eastern traditions, and melded them and repackaged the pagan worship in a monotheistic form. Islam today means submission, they tell us, but what it originally meant was the defiance of death, heroism, to die in battle, that strength which characterized a desert warrior who, even when faced with impossible odds, would fight to the death for his tribe. That's what the term originally meant. It's a warrior cult, and is so to this day. It slowly evolved into its present meaning, which means submission. Incidentally, the word assassin, which I think all of us are familiar with, is an Arabic word. It was taken from a Muslim sect that believed that Allah had called them to kill people as a sacred duty. That's where it originally comes from. I think that's interesting. The one true God, just because something is monotheistic doesn't mean it's the worship of the true and living God. There were different times that Ra, Isis, or Osiris in Egypt was worshipped as the one God. There were times that Baal or Moloch was worshipped by Chaldea. Zeus or Jupiter by the Greeks. Monotheism doesn't imply that they're worshiping the same God. Muhammad packaged the 7th century Arabian paganism into a monotheistic form. By the way, it's kind of interesting that the Vatican, if you check Vatican II, if you are a Muslim, the Catholic Church treats you as saved because you worship one God. If you're a Protestant, there are 100 anathemas pronounced against you, condemning you to hell. You say that sounds inflammatory? Check out Vatican II. That is the doctrine from the official doctrine of the Catholic Church. It's interesting to see, watch closely in the heraldry of Catholic items for the symbols of the crescent moon. There's a strange, mysterious affinity between Islam and the Vatican, but that's a whole other subject. The agenda of Islam. Let's understand what the agenda of Islam is. Islam divides the universe into two parts, only two parts. Dar al-Islam, the domain of the faithful to Islam, and Dar al-Arab, which is those with whom we are at war until Judgment Day. Only two parts. It is a militant belief set on conquest. Now, with an irrevocable commitment to conquer the West, and now because of their oil revenues and because they now have nuclear weapons, they believe that they have the resources to separate the world from the Judeo-Christian tradition. Let's give you some examples from the Quran. Surah 9:5 says, "Fight and slay the pagans," meaning the infidels, "wherever you find them, and seize them, beleaguer them, and lie in wait for them in every stratagem of war." Surah 9:5. In Surah 9:73, "Prophet, make war on the unbelievers and hypocrites and deal rigorously with them." In Surah 8:59, "Let not the unbelievers think they will ever get away. They have not the power to do so. Muster against them all the men and cavalry at your command so that you may strike terror into the enemy of God and your enemy. Prophet," meaning Muhammad, "rouse the faithful to arms if they," that is the non-Muslims, "incline to peace," that is, what they mean by that is to accept Islam, "make peace with them. If they reject your judgment, know that it is Allah's wish to scourge them for their sins. Their punishment is execution or crucifixion or the cutting off of hands and feet from the opposite sides or exile from the land," and so on. These are just some samples from the Quran. I encourage you to get a copy, skim it through, to get a feeling for what they regard as their holy book. In Surah 5:51 is a very key passage. "Believers," meaning Muslims, "take neither Jews nor Christians to be your friends. They are friends with one another. Whoever of you seeks their friendship shall become one of their number. And God does not guide the wrongdoers," meaning the Jewish and Christians. Surah 5:51. Remember that. Another key element, the Quran and the Hadith are their sacred books. The Hadith is to the Islam sort of what the Talmud is to the Jew. It's just a highly venerated commentary. In the Hadith, it gives you some idea of the incentives they have. There's another act which elevates the position of a man in paradise to a grade 100, meaning higher, and the elevation between one grade and the other is equal to the height of heaven above the earth. He said, "What is that act?" He replied, "Jihad in the name of Allah." Jihad in the name of Allah. They believe if they're martyred in the cause of Allah, that they go to the highest level of paradise. And there's a lot of other things that are unmentionable before a large audience that they're promised. I'll leave that out for right now. Let's talk about the Quran, their so-called holy book. They call it a holy book. The order of it's confused. It self-contradicts itself. It's claimed to be in perfect Arabic in at least 4 passages. And yet there's over 100 aberrations of even Arabic errors. It's claimed to be free of error. Let's take a look at it. It claims to be consistent with the Bible. Surah 7:51 and 10:3 claim 6 days of creation. Surah 41 claims 8 days of creation. Doesn't agree. Surah 32 to 48 disagree with Genesis 7, and we could go on and on. There are numerous errors concerning Abraham. His father's name was not Azar. He did not live in Mecca. He did not sacrifice Ishmael. He had 8 sons, not 2. 3 wives, not 2. He did not build the Kaaba. There's no evidence he's ever in Mecca. He was not thrown in the fire by Nimrod. There's a little anachronism there. It even gets worse. The chronological errors. The flood did not occur in Moses' day, as implied by in Surah 7 and so on. Not a big deal. We can go on and on. The point is, a little bit of scholarship will show you that this is just an amalgam of legends and so forth. Now, Muhammad himself had 16 wives, 2 concubines, 4 others, even though the Quran forbids more than 4 wives. Muhammad was not sinless. He never performed a single miracle. He did not die for anyone, and no personal relationship with him is possible because he's dead. Just to set that aside, okay? I'd like to just touch in this brief survey on 5 myths of Islam. They say Islam is a religion of love. Nowhere in the Quran does it command you to love. About 37 cases where Allah loves this and Allah loves that, but nothing that tells you to love. Nowhere is love commanded in the Quran. Now, in contrast to that, of course, the Bible astounds even Jewish scholars when they hear Jesus summarize the entire Bible in just 2 commands.